Okay. I will suggest to start with Professor Irina Anna Drobot, if she's ready for the presentation.
Yes,
She's
I'm
teaching
ready.
English to engineers, as I understand, between English language teaching and psychology, to Technical University of Civil and Engineering of Bucharest, right? In Department of
Yes.
Foreign Language and Communication. Professor Irina Anna Dobot, it's highly specialized in the following area of scientific research, and language coming into contact to the conquest or colonization, bilingualism and multilingualism as a reflection of political trends, and contemporary lifestyles, official languages, and heritage languages. The field of language education is also treated when it comes to the benefits of being bilingual and to multilingual, which are so analyzed from the perspective of evolutionary psychology, with the claim that knowledge of several languages ensures survival and better living condition. In the next few minutes, we will have a very interesting presentation focused on the subject, culture, memory, landmarks in history, Lilac Girls by Martha Hall Kelly and Sarah's Key by Tatiana de Rosnay. Sorry if I mispronounce, missing some information about you. You are now on the floor and you can share your presentation. Maybe you can open also your video.
Yes. I will share my PowerPoint now. Thank you
Okay,
for your
please.
introduction. So this is my my PowerPoint. I hope you can all see it. My presentation will be from the perspective of history, memory, and culture. I will treat these novels from the perspective of Lotman. He believes that historical events receive various interpretations through mass media, through fiction. I will discuss two drama novels that present history from the perspective of those that experience it directly, from the perspective of the characters that live right through the historical moment, but also from the perspective of present day characters that find out about the historical event. And in the case of Sarah's Key, they begin to do research to understand what has happened. The first novel, Lilac Girls, was published in 2016. It treats the subject of the Ravensbrück's women's camp from World War II. The story is presented from the perspective of the characters from 1946 to 1948, the years after the war. And also we have a monologue of one of the characters from 1959 when she tells us about her feelings about what has happened. In Sarah's Key, the novel published in 2006, we have to deal with an episode in from 1942. This is the Valdiv's roundup in the lives of the Jews living in France. And we also have the another story from the perspective of the characters in May 2002, when they discover the anniversary of this event, and especially the story of a Jewish family who actually went through these events. When we talk about semiotics and culture from Lotman's perspective, we can see that for him, semiotics is interlinked with the cultural phenomena. It means that communication and information processing are the main aspects of culture. We noticed that Lotman proposes a definition of culture based on the way it is organized, the way it is preserved. What is important about culture is the preservation of information, and in the case of these novels, the preservation of the historical events through the constant needs to remember them. For Lotman, culture is structured like a communication system. It communicates past historical events. We have the memory of what the community has experienced. We also have the view of the ability of autocommunication, which is very important for Lotman, which is the basis of the memory of culture. For Lotman, we have in the idea of autocommunication, first of all, the mnemonic type, which tells us what is already known. And second, we have autocommunication as a type of discovery or as a part of inspiration, where the information that we have now will correlate with the previous information that we have. And this is precisely the structure of the two novels, because we have episodes both from past and from present, and we notice the link between the characters. Place is a very important element in this approach to culture through semiosis. Place is like a landmark. So first of all, we have Veldiv in Seraski, then we have Ravensbrück's camp, two places that will to which the characters will come back throughout their lives, but also new characters living at present will understand what's going on with them. Place is a means to remember the event. It's also a means for characters to rethink about their experiences. It's, after all, a visual representation of the historical event. It becomes a symbol. These places are visited later in time by the characters who experienced the events, but also visited by the ones that find out about the event and about their significance for their culture. Here I have a few fragments from the book Lilac Girls. The fragments are all related to the place, Ravensbrück's camp. What is particularly noticeable is that in the beginning, in the Polish girl's narration of the events, the name doesn't appear until later, because this reflects their perception of the place. They don't know where they are, what is going on. The name will appear later. We also have the perspective of a doctor from the German side. She also is confused a bit by the place at the firstly when she appears, and then she believes that it has a pleasant sounding name, because she has the hope that here she will be able to practice medicine eventually. We also have a fragment where the characters talk about the very rare situations of escaping the camp, and in the end, in 1945, this is the fragment on the left, right below. One of the main characters remembers this place. She goes back and tries to remember what happened. In Sarah's key, we also notice the repetition um, of the associations and also of the name of the place. In the first fragment, we don't have the name of the place either, just as in the other novel. We deal here with a family of Jews, and their daughter has actually locked her young brother in a cupboard where they used to play, because she believes that they will return soon and come after him, and she just wanted to be him to be safe. In the other fragments, we on the fragment in the upper right, we have the perspective of the contemporary characters who are trying to find out about what happened. Here, nobody remembers much. They are trying to find survivors, witnesses to the event. And eventually they will go to the story of the family that is presented in the first fragment. Below on the left, we find out about the books that are out of print and about this event. It hasn't been much remembered. We also have in the fragment right below, where the search for this event begins. The contemporary characters are journalists, and eventually they will find Sarah, the little girl, who and they will try to put together the story. To conclude my presentation, place is a means of preserving the memories. It becomes a very visual symbol of the historical events. Place is what remains after all these events, and they can serve as a reminder or as a means to start searching about significant events in the past of a culture and the way that these events have affected the presence. We also become aware of the place that is occupied by historical events in any culture, and about the public, but also about the private and personal implications for those that are going through these events. We notice that two novels present past and present perspectives over the historical events, exactly as Lotman claims that culture is mostly affected by communication, and we noticed that there is a lot of communication about past events during the present time. I would like in the end to thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Irina Nadobro, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Dear colleagues, if you agree, then I would suggest that we ask the questions at the end of our presentations so that each panelist can complete their presentation. Do you agree?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Now we have Professor Virginia Stankiewicz and Professor Davia Savicievicin. Please forgive me if I mispronounce your name. Virginia, it's much easy to say so if you allow me, Virginia and Daiva. Okay, Virginia, it's affiliated and it's coming from the Kaunas University of Technology, if I'm not wrong. And Daiva is researcher and professor at the Faculty of Social Science, Art of Humanities, Institute of Social Science. And they are both researcher and teacher. In the next few minutes, we will hear a very interesting presentation focused on the subject, reality and interpretation expression tools in online media. Please, Virginia and Davia have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a very nice introduction. So I will share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
you can put on the full screen if
yes,
can.
I will.
Thank you. Yeah, it's
all right. Yeah, it's okay. Good. So hello, ladies and gentlemen, once more. It's our honor to present our research in your conference. And as the moderator mentioned, we are the teachers, the lecturers from Kaunas University of Technology in Lithuania. And the topic of our presentation is reality and interpretation expression tools in online media. So globalization, social development, and political events have greatly affected the lexicon of online media. It is widely acknowledged that media has a huge influence on forming public opinion, while the presented content does not always comply with the reality. It is worthwhile mentioning that the media most frequently identifies issues that need to be addressed. That is, it creates an image of social reality. But recently, researchers on the meaning of the word have particularly become relevant in order to find out how it impacts the reader. The linguistic effect in terms of discourse is said to be frequently occurring as a manipulative verbal tool. The choice of linguistic tools is mostly determined by the purpose of communication. That is not only to retain the reader's attention, but also to affect the reader's consciousness and feelings. And the meaning of the word is the basis of transferring the communicative function of a language. However, in addition to the main meaning, other meanings are used in the media that provide additional secondary information to the content of the word and are sometimes associated with judgment, imagery, and etc. The aim of our research was to analyze health-related articles in online news portals and study what tools are employed in online media communication in Lithuania, what verbal means are applied in conveying information, how content and meaning are related to each other, and what rhetorics is used to form online discourse. The objective of our research was online portals, news online portals, Delfi LT, Elrytas LT, and Respublika LT. And the articles of 2020 and 2021, they were selected for the analysis of linguistic features of health discourse. Referring to the content of online media, the study discusses the growing influence of tools of new media language in forming the reader's information acceptance and its perception. Not only does technological innovation influence the creation and dissemination of content, but it also determines the desire to convey as much information as possible to the reader and as quickly as possible. To render this, features of linguistic language that help to form a specific impression on the reader are frequently used. It should be mentioned that each author is individual, and individuality is reflected not only in the perception of meanings, but also in linguistic features. Lexical means perform a certain function in the text. Neutral vocabulary is associated with information function. The use of the future tense of a verb can convey predictions of earlier processes or possible changes in society. Syntactic features such as sentence length, its structure, indicate addressee orientation, interaction with dialogue language, and function performed definitely. Thus, style intertwines the chosen means of expression consciously and unconsciously. which often depend not only on the interpersonal function, but also on the author's approach to the subjects described. And as the research shows, there are 4 author approaches to the subject described. So the authors believe in the truth modality of the subjects in question, which can vary from absolute certainty to complete disbelief. Then obligation, where the writer expresses his views on what is to be done. Permission or consent, and desirability, where the author expresses agreement or disagreement regarding the subject matter. Recently, most of the discussion, definitely in online media, has been on the topic of health. So this presentation aims to reveal how qualitatively the media is able to present health-related information, what language tools it applies to present information to the reader. The articles of some headlines of 2020 and 2021 were selected for the analysis on health discourse from those online portals that I showed a minute ago, Delphi, Alritas, and Respublica. These are the articles in this category reveal various peculiarities in the medical area, the medicine, the quality of medical work, healthcare facilities, and etc., etc. Different portals were chosen deliberately. They sometimes describe the same event, but they reveal a different level of interpretation. When the original source of information is not delved deeply into, but the information presented is either interpreted in some way by various journalists and editors. After analyzing the articles, it can be stated that in 2020, starting in March, most articles were related to the spread and consequences of that terrible coronavirus that we all are experiencing right now. And only articles in 2021 show the exhaustion of this topic. They show that there are other health-related subjects and other problems. And they show the author's perception and disclose the health risks and accomplishments. Now, if we assess the emotional charge of those 2 years, so you can see from the diagram that the negative charge in 2020 prevails, it dominates, like 70% of the headlines and articles, they were carrying the negative charge. And there were only 20% of articles that, well, showed the situation more or less positively. Well, in 2021, the situation changes. As we see, there are many more articles, like 55% of the analyzed articles that carry the positive charge, and only 30%, the negative charge decreased, and we could see some optimism and the good news, definitely. It was found that although the title and the end of the article are considered informationally prominent positions, but the negativity often contained in them is often unjustified because it does not emerge from the text itself. It reflects only one aspect, and I can illustrate it with the example. I wrote the Lithuanian quotation and then in italics translated that into English. It's much easier for everybody to follow. That in English and Lithuanian, the sickness rate of coronavirus is again one of the highest in the European Union. We rose to the second place. So in a literal and figurative sense, this negativity is very evident in the online media of 2020. It could even be said that this is one of the main features of the health-related press of the time. Negativity is expressed in text by direct and neutral naming of the evils of life, using very strong words like official, increases, died, one of the insidious or hazardous sicknesses, and deadly virus. And of course, it influences people and impacts the reader greatly. So the examples of this negativity expression could be according to the information of Health Center, 2 weeks after the last injection, that people had to be hospitalized and some of them died, that the number of Americans infected after vaccinations is increasing. So the verbs presented in this context, like had to be hospitalized and died and increase, they carry the message to the reader that there is nothing good about that vaccination, that even people after the vaccine, they get infected and even die, and the information provided in the media is incorrect. In the articles, it is possible to single out a much more subtle negativity where the reader has to read between the lines. Used in the language, we see the usage of particles, already, even, more, like in those examples that there are 504 new cases of infection and 7 more people died. And the next example, even impairments of hearing and sight can occur. So the word more in this example is used with the numeral, and it seems that it is sending a message to the reader that the mortality level is still increasing and it is not clear when it will end. Even is a particle that emphasizes the message sent before, that it is very scary, because among other disorders, there could be the hearing and vision problems that people can suffer from them, and such intensifying particles in the text, they're quite common. And their purpose in the text is to influence people's knowledge of certain things and cause doubts that something is not yet known. Now, health-related articles are presented, as I said, differently in 2021, and we saw a lot of metaphors used in the text. For example, the number of COVID patients treated at the hospital is also pulling down a little bit. Like a proportion of positive diagnostic text is preparing to attack it. Just a very literal translation, just to see those metaphors that are used in the text. To pull a little down, the saying, to pull a little down, it could be perceived by the readers as negative, but looking at this context, we see that the number is decreasing from 145 to 120 this morning. And the word "штурмувати" in the second example means a very aggressive attack. It is related to combat and war, but the figurative meaning of this word emerges in the context, and it is perceived as an urgent work, a campaign, that the result of which are positive, and they can carry, you know, a favorable effect on the readers. Now, one more metaphor is like the fruit of vaccination are also calculated. Well, fruit is definitely used in the figurative meaning, and we see it as, you know, the results of vaccination are calculated, that like we see that it's really very positive and the readers feel favorable and have positive emotions about the results. Now, what we noticed in our research was the coinage of new words. As for the emotional, positive and negative charge in the text, new words have been coined in the Lithuanian language in health-related articles. In pursuance of persuasiveness, clarity, but sometimes having negative effects. And definitely the word with which the new words are coined is corona. And we found a total of 30 of such words in those texts. So those nouns newly coined with the component corona, they can carry negative, positive, or neutral shades. So the neutral meaning depends on the context. For example, if we have the word corona show. So during the corona show, arrogant manipulations of numbers, of concepts, magical concealment of facts. Yes, something begins to crawl out to the surface. So the meaning of a word show is related to something very positive, to performance or entertainment, which carries the positive emotions and attitudes. But when we look at this example, we see that corona show takes quite a different meaning. And especially when you go further in the context with the words arrogant manipulations and concealment of facts, we see that the presentation in such text sends a message to the reader that it is not an event to be very happy about or even participating there. So in this text, Corona show means artificially created and really negatively charged events. And the following are the 16 derivatives of nouns that we found in the text, which have a negative connotation, like Corona circus, the first one is the Lithuanian word, and then the translation like Coronaphobia, Corona threat, Corona infection, crisis, and Corona death. And sometimes these comparisons are used in text to influence the reader more convincingly. So for example, as global corona panic expands, it's easy to feel like you are watching an ultra-high pilot circus magic show where the tricks performed seem realistic and highly engaging. So in this example, we see that ultra-high pilot circus magic show, we understand that it is really a highly valued thing and very interesting one. But looking at the context, the message is sent to the reader that it can be entertaining, but even misleading. There is nothing very positive about that. The second example, Corona Guiltinea, we do not have the same translation in English, like the symbol of death, the one with the sword above your head, that something is waiting, something bad is waiting for you. Excuse me. So Corona death is used to emphasize the fact that the person, nevertheless, he or she died from some other reasons, but still in the Mediate is shown that the person died from coronavirus. So after those examples in our research, we draw the following conclusions: that analyzing the health-related articles, it is natural that most of them in 2020, they are related to pandemics and COVID, that the articles are dominated by negativity, fear, and they are expressed in newly created nouns and verbs and idioms and figurative words and metaphors. And they provide a special perspective on the perception and interpretation of the world and emphasizing certain ways of understanding the reality. And in 2021, the press is dominated by neutral and more positively emotionally charged sentences related to health. And comparing the articles of both years, it should be mentioned that in the text of this year, in addition to the topic of the pandemics and its course, there is already a subtopic, articles related to vaccination, in which readers are sent a message about the benefits and of course about the risks of vaccination. So linguistic research of journalistic style texts reveals a social assessment of facts or events, as well as direct impact on an individual, on the reader who perceives the information and whether he believes it or not, or just searches the other portals to see whether the information was true, whether it was fake. So thank you very much for your patience and for listening to our presentation. Thank you.
Professor Virginia Andavia, thank you very much. You did a very interesting presentation, and I think there will be questions and comments on this topic, but I would ask you to write down your questions or and put them on the chat or raise them directly at the end of our presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see Professor Joseph Williams. He's here, or is someone who represent him? No. In that case, we pass him, and we will miss him, of course. We go to Professor Miran Bocevic. He is a very talented and internationally recognized professor at the University of Arizona. A new finding by an international team of anthropologists suggests that human ancestral social structure may be the root of cumulative culture and cooperation and ultimately human uniqueness. In the next few minutes, we will hear a very interesting presentation focused on the subject, semiotic closures joined to shape cultural evolution. Please, Professor, have the floor. We can't hear you. Maybe still not. Now we can hear you. Yes. No.
Okay, because this is my better microphone. My better microphone obviously doesn't have the batteries to do it.
Okay, now it's working. Thank you.
Yes. Let me see. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so one correction. I mean, Arizona State University is where I got my doctorate. I'm right now employed in several places because, of course, in the United States, you can't really get a job. So you need to live with someone and teach as a professor at several universities. But it's an interesting experience. It's really
Thank you.
So the research is limited to theoretical topics. But so I'm approaching this as an anthropologist, and I'm looking as an anthropologist, how can we bridge the gap that we have as social scientists, both towards humanities and towards natural sciences. And here, semiotics and semiotics of culture is, you know, the natural answer, because signs are something that has effects in our everyday lives, and you know, we see that. I mean, we don't need evidence to see that you know, symbolic representations have effects and can, in many cases, make a difference for people between life and death. You know, we can go to Geertz if we actually need evidence, but I think we just need to turn on the news to see that, right? And here we can see cultural symbols as sources of information that, you know, inform some kinds of activities, some kinds of events, practices later on. And then the question becomes, how can we think of symbols as a natural phenomenon? Can we make a connection between our natural material world, which we inhabit, and the symbols that we use? What are symbols if we look at them simply physically? So I'm going to present a part of their argument of how we can do that. I'm going to present a concept of semiotic closure, with which some people might or might not be familiar, that lets us look at symbols as parts of material natural processes. This actually brings us back quickly to the topic of evolution, to the topic of how natural, of how signification first evolved. But if we apply it to human culture, and if we look for these semiotic closures, for these kinds of recurring cyclical processes in human culture, we can see that they exist on many levels. And I'm going to run through those 4 different levels: personal, enacted, inscribed, distributed, and say a few words of what actually Lotman says about them, because I've been reading Lotman, and it's actually amazing how much he anticipated. And that's basically it. So the concept itself, the concept of semiotic closure, comes from Howard Bate. His paper, I think, is called "How Does a Molecule Become a Message?" And he says, if we want to understand science, we shouldn't look at human culture. We shouldn't look at our minds. We shouldn't look at, you know, we have it too rich. It's too hard to say what a symbol is from looking at that. We should look at something that's very simple, that acts like a symbol. And of course, he looks at genes. He looks at the genetic code. And he says, okay, so how does a molecule become a message? It is relatively inert. There are only limited kinds of interactions reactions that it can enter into. But it can inform an arbitrary wide range of interactions through some kind of an internal structure that it has, right? So it presents a sequence of information that affects some kinds of further actions, which can be really arbitrarily far away, and that those effects include a possible recurrence or reproduction of the message itself, of the capacity to read it. And so that means that in order to have a message, there needs to be this kind of really an open, reproductive, or recurring system that reads the message and that reproduces, which we see in living organisms. Now, the question is, okay, so how does this happen in culture? And I'm not going to run through all of this. I'm leaving this on the slide for people who are interested in seeing the various sources of various ways to think of cultural signs as parallel to genes. The entire gene meme dialogue. But really, the point is that cultural signs can be anywhere in the activity. In our cultural interactions, whenever we do something, they're everywhere. So it means that all our cultural practices, because they're shared, learned, recurring, meaningful, are in some way semiotically closed. So we're in essence spoiled for choice. And if we look at various places where, and this is a very crude representation of a cultural interaction, if we look at the places where we can find those symbols, we can find them in our bodies, we can find them in our actions. So what's in our bodies is kind of reddish here, what's in our actions is kind of greenish, and then in the situation, in the context in which we're actually acting. So that's the blue circle. It's not shown in a different color over here. So there can be a semiotic closure in each of these different symbolic representations. And so just to run through them, and please let me know if I'm running out of time, but I'm gonna be quick here. So looking at the personal level, so looking at the symbolic representations that we have, and we think of these as in our minds, but they can be anywhere in our bodies. So I'm just loosely calling them embodied. They are, and it's interesting because all of these ways of semiotic closure do correspond to a treatment of social power in Eric Wolf's, including those quotes there, how he describes them. But these are the representations that we have in our command, that every person has in our command. And there was, I think, a very elucidating part in Lotman in which he talks about how we often make new sense of our thoughts if we go through them when there is some kind of a rhythmic supplementary, what he calls a supplementary code, which comes back to the fact that cycles introduce new meaning, right? That in order to have meaning, you have cycles. So the next one is in intersubjective interaction, and this is really all meaningful social practice, everything that we ever do with other people. Is a semiotic closure of these symbols, of the symbols that are public, the symbols that Geertz talked about. And here there is a tension on the one hand between the need to transmit faithfully, the need to transmit the message faithfully, which then requires a shared code, such as a shared language. But then, because our cultural world is so rich, what we share differs with different people. I mean, I don't have to explain this specifically. And here, what's interesting, and where there is a connection between what Lotman is talking about and relational sociology, this is Harrison White, is this idea, really, the fact that new interpretations, the creation of new information, comes from translation between, attempts to translate between codes that cannot necessarily be translated very well between, right? Harrison White talks about meanings come from switching. There are various ways in which cultural identities try to establish a sense of control, and then when we switch between those different ways, that's where that's where new meaning is created. So there is this tension between the necessity to just communicate and thus not add anything to information, and the fact that misunderstanding is in fact creative. Then there are the inscribed symbols. So this is the closure between what's in the setting before the interaction and what's in the setting after the interaction. And this is really something that most semiotics actually studies, because something needs to be written down for it to be studied, for example, in literature, right? Or it needs to be expressed in any art, and it's inscribed and recorded in some way for us to be able to analyze. And I'm not going to go into the details here. I think here what was very interesting here for me was the this discussion of theater as meeting between the still images and narrative expression on one end and lived experience on the other. And in general, how written word and how any kind of inscription imposes structure and reflects some kind of ideas of what's important in history or not, right? On how the structure of historical writing is imposed partly by the medium. So and then there is a fourth level of semiotic culture that does not exist in this simple schema here, because it exists on a higher level, and that's the dynamics in the culture at large. And here, and again, what I found really interesting is that Lotman actually specifically talks about autocatalysis in his Semiotics of Culture. And of course, autocatalytic networks have been at that same time, early 90s, studied in the Santa Fe Institute as a way to simulate the origin of life. And this is the exact connection that Lotman also makes. But the way this happens is that these kinds of networks of interactions, and this is a very simple one, very schematic one here shown, they become complex enough to kind of start to compete between different variants, and also to be able to spread to in arbitrarily many directions. And it is at that time when they start exhibiting some aspects of life, of living beings, and also where we can meaningfully talk about intention and representation and adaptation, right? So so eventually there is this push for representational systems such as symbolic systems to evolve on this network. And bringing this to society, so if we look at the dynamics that look like this in society, what we have is really this this fact that when we enact some social symbol, we enact very many social dynamics at the same time, right? So symbols have many, all cultural symbols have many, carry many meanings at the same time as carrying a cultural memory. And that really there certainly are many layers of these kinds of autocatalytic interactions in our culture, which, if you look only at the representational side of it, looks very much like Lotman's semiosphere, right? In which some kinds of power relationships inside it could be reflected through attempts to set up some cultural forms and some cultural interpretations as the core, as the standard, but then that only pushes some ways off being creative to the periphery, to the periphery of this amazing connection that he makes with Prigogine and Stengers, and with the dynamic, with the theory of dynamic systems and so on. So just to finish this, I'm including these two quotes, which are, one is a bit more visceral by Lotman, and then more of a vegetarian interpretation by Eco of whether culture is like a body or like an ecology. I mean, I think this is a very, very important question, and it can be addressed by making these kinds of connections. And it's a bit of both. Anyway.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Miran Bozovic. Now we open the question session. If we have some question, you can put it now on the table.
Now, if you allow me, Sebastian, I have a commentary and a short question for Miran.
Please, Sorin.
Sorin, I am Miran. Hello again. Miran, I'm sorry, I haven't saw down science the beginning of your presentation. I am managed the other session in parallel, but I was stuck by the mathematical modeling by which you try to explain certain semiotic notions. Moreover, I make something in this sense in my research. So we have noticed certain connection with biosemiotics, in the sense what we try to integrate the semiotic behavior of living organisms in our abstract model of meaning construction. I notice in your presentation a notion as network, graphs, information exchange channels, which are very similar to the way cells in living organisms communicate. So what do you think? How could we integrate the biological Umwelt in terms of Hughes level, and the cultural one?
That's actually a long. I mean, I have some suggestions, but I would need to talk for about an hour. I mean, I think the question is looking for these closures, and then I mean, I've actually come to this because I come from a more natural scientific background, but and it really and it really seems to me that there's this disconnect between interpretive and quantitative approaches, which shouldn't be there, because it I think requires patiently looking at different ways representation is structured throughout evolutionary history. Maynard Smith and Zastmari, and again, I'm butchering someone's Hungarian name, had a book about it in the 90s called The Major Transitions in Evolution. And that you know, and I've actually done some work in just schematizing different ways in which this semiotic role gets distributed really all around the body. And also, I mean, Jesper Hoffmeyer wrote about it a lot, right?
Yes, thank you, Miran, for your answer. Actually, it's about the role of modeling in construction of meaning, and it's a lot of discussion about this. I hope we have the chance to continue our exchange ideas. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you very much, Sorin. I have a question for Irina, if you can hear me. Irina,
Yes, I can hear you.
You identify a certain structure of writers thinking when they narrate to get into the reader's mind. Is there a pattern, a shame that writers use as a formula to enter, I don't know how to say, in the reader's unconscious zone? After your opinion?
Yes, I think they use empathy as a strategy, first of all, and they can also use some narrative structures from Vonnegut structures, such as the man in the hole structure, where the situation is good at first, it gets bad, then it somehow gets solved. Because in these novels are especially based on emotions. First of all, everything seems normal in these families during both historical events. Then they have the problem when they are taken away to concentration camps, and eventually the characters and also who went through the experience, and also the others who participate in their story, try to find a solution to become better psychologically. I think this appeals to readers.
Thank you very much, Professor Irina. I have a second question for Professor Virginia and Eva. A curiosity, I'm very curious how the year 2022 will look like in this evolution of communication, as the media shape the language of emotions according to the feelings of the moment, from fear to hope, or from normality to apocalypse.
Well, I don't think that there would be an apocalypse. No, the apocalypse of the last year, I think that was more than enough for all of us.
It's already enough, yes.
I truly believe that there would be more positivity than we found negativity in the articles and in the headline. Let's hope for the better situation, for the best. No, not apocalypse, please, no. Thank you for your question.
Yes, and dear Professor Miran Bozevic, at one point you mentioned a very interesting example. Courtly love doesn't apply to a peasant woman. You give this example in one time in your presentation, in one slide. Do you think that communication barrier between cultures today depend on social status, as they did in the 19th century, for example, or it is just a problem of language perception limited by education, as Wittgenstein mentioned in Tractatus Philosophicus?
Yes to all of the above. I mean, certainly a part of the misunderstandings between people is comes from the kinds of interpretive pictures they use to interpret the world around them, right? But then a part of every relationship of social inequality, there is this gap in awareness in which people who are usually in the privileged position have less knowledge of the lives of the people who are in a subordinate position, but more feeling of agency from whatever they interpret, whatever they want the world to be, whereas the people in the subordinate position are the opposite. Their stories are not heard, but they have to hear the stories and be shaped by the stories of these others. Charles Mills did work in this. It's called, it's basically called it's the study of ignorance in philosophy. He looked at the racial mode of it in the United States as basically he talked about how in the U.S. White people are brought up into ignorance basically of those on whose their lives depend on, and so there is ignorance, but in many cases there is the ignorance is willful, and we do need this communication between humanities and social sciences in order to understand it.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your anthropologist point of view. It's very, very useful for us, for our discussion. If we have more questions, I see a professor here, Si Suk Lee. I read on your eyes that you want to put some questions, please.
Can you hear me? Because
yes, of course.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I have a question to this COVID second speaker. So, because COVID is so painful all around the world, not only emotional, but becomes political or economical. So when you interpret this all collection data, I don't know what you are going to use, but I just want to know whether when we interpret something which is very, very sensitive, is there any limitation to interpret in terms of morality, moral? Because we cannot interpret it, we have to continue, we should not destroy also this. So whether we have any limitation in semiotic limit of our semiotic interpretation?
Well, as we noticed that there is a limitation, definitely. The interpretation is up to a certain level, that it would not hurt people's feelings and emotions, because it's really a very sensitive topic, and nobody knew how to deal with all this terrible thing there. But the limitations were applied, that the press and the online media would not be, cruel to people. So we noticed that all the headlines and the articles, they were using expressive words, strong, emotionally charged words, but they were okay, they were normal, they would not hurt anybody. If I answered your question. Yeah, definitely, limitations were there, that the journalists could not write what they wanted. We didn't notice that. It was pretty...
May I have a very short question? The Professor Miran, you mentioned the semiotic closer. Is there a new terminology? Because I'm suffering so much. Everybody make the new word, a new term of the semiotic, maybe openness could be possible. So this is the semiotic closer I heard here first time in my life. So I think we must be with not new, but we must be, I have a little conflict. How far we can use this term, semiotic, after that, any noun or adjective?
Yeah, not new terminology. Howard Pate, I'm not 100% sure of the exact of the exact year. He called it first semantic closure, then he changed his mind and called it semiotic closure. He was I'll type his name here in the chat. This kind of a crossover scholar who started off as a physicist and then tried to understand how genetic code is informational. And then later on, someone told him that he was actually doing biosemiotics. So he said, okay, I guess I'm doing biosemiotics. But yeah, so he talks about semiotic closure, and he defines it. It's
Okay, any more questions? So I would like to thank everyone for the successful presentations, for questions, for discussions that have taken place in this topic. I hope we got to know each other better and that we can remain friends, even online in the digital world, and collaborate, why not, in the future on different project and research. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you, everyone. And see you tomorrow to the next panels and interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Great job, Sebastian. Thank you.
Mersi mult, am rămas și cu un student al nostru, cu un coleg, cu...
Da. Ai reușit, Firmilian, să intri până la urmă. Mă bucur.
Bună ziua! Da, am reușit.
Bravo!
Da, vă mulțumesc foarte mult!
Cu drag!
One moment, I have to stop the recording.
Tu ești la final,